Hi, and welcome back to the Android video series. Today we're going to talk about toggle buttons and radio groups. Toggle buttons are a little bit less complex than you think they would be to implement, and radio groups are a little bit more complex than you think they would be to implement. So there are some gotchas when we try to implement Android applications that include these controls. So that's why I wanted to single them out and talk about them separately. So first of all, toggle buttons have two states, kind of like the way they sound. They have an on state and they have an off state. In the on state, the light on the button is on. In other words, there is by default a little blue bar at the bottom of the button, and that bar will be blue if it's on and black if it's not. And the is checked property of the button is true. In the off state, the is checked property of the button is false. Also, the text on the button changes, and by default, this is either a capital on or a capital off. And this can be changed by changing the text on and text off Android attributes in the layout file. So by default, the button has functionality. If you click it, the state changes from on to off and from off to on again. So we use these to control or enable some other process, state, or control in the application. We could use these to show or hide a control, maybe show or hide a view group, or even a fragment that we're going to talk about in the next video discussion. We could execute one or another branch of code depending on the state of the toggle. We could, for example, use the toggle as a gate to allow the user to perform something or deny the user, so kind of an unlock button. It could also function as another check that the user really wants to make some change. In other words, they could lock or unlock something like a text edit control, an edit text control, or something like that, to enable or disable its usage. So toggle buttons are really very useful, and we need to understand how to use them because it is much simpler to implement a toggle button that the user understands the functionality of using a toggle button than it would be to implement the same functionality using a regular button control. So radio buttons. Radio buttons we are familiar with from HTML code. Radio buttons are used to select one of two or more options, or as an alternative to checkboxes. Now, the reason I say or as an alternative to checkboxes is this. There is a checkbox control in Android. Many people think that the radio button is a more beautiful interface than the checkbox. If you want to use radio buttons as checkboxes, this is perfectly acceptable. In fact, radio buttons all by themselves will only function as checkboxes unless we put them in a radio group. What do I mean by that? Well, by default, if I just put 3 or 4 radio buttons in my layout and don't put them in a radio group, what will happen? What will happen is I'm able to select as many of those radio buttons as I want to. Unless they're in a group, unless they're in a radio group container, they function as checkboxes. If they are in a radio group container, they will function as radio buttons. Within a radio group, we can either poll the checked state of each button separately to find out which button is selected, or let's say we're only interested in one particular button, or we can also get the one button that's checked using the OnCheckedChange Listener interface that goes with the radio group. Now, when we use OnCheckedChange Listener, now I'm going to talk about this in the next slide, we must make sure we import the right OnCheckedChange Listener. In other words, when you make your activity and say implements OnCheckedChange Listener, and if you're relying on the tooltip to do your import, make sure you get the right import. The one that says radio group.OnCheckedChange Listener is the correct one. The other one is incorrect, and you will be confused There will be many compile time errors that pop up if you try to do, for example, what we're doing in the example code, in the demo code for radio buttons. So make sure you've got the right import. OnCheckedChange Listener now. The activity using a radio group has to implement OnCheckedChange Listener. OnCheckedChange Listener is an interface. So we implement this Java interface, and then we use find view by ID with the ID of the group, not the radio buttons, but the ID of the radio group itself. So the radio group must have an ID. A radio group is kind of a wrapper. It is not something that you can drag out and place on your interface from the tools palette when we're looking at building the layout. We have to go into the XML and actually put the radio group into the XML. Now, we call set OnCheckedChange Listener on the radio group that we get by using find view by ID, and then we use a parameter of this. Now this is the main activity, or the activity that's controlling the radio group, right? So this is the OnCheckedChange Listener because it is implementing OnCheckedChange Listener. Now, when you set this up, you're going to have to override one method, and that is OnCheckedChanged. Notice the spelling. There's an extra D after change. And this has two parameters, the radio group itself and then an integer. And that integer is passed into this method, and we can use it to find the element of the radio button that is selected. So the int parameter is the ID of the selected radio button. And it's as simple as that. But, again, unless you really go digging to find all this information out, it can be a little bit confusing. So I'm laying it all out for you here in this discussion.